This is Brett Johnson in New York City with OneMedRadio. Today we are with Marcus Hadley and Christian Haler with MPR Associates, an international design firm that spends a lot of their energies in the area of medical devices. They've been part of a series we've done, an expert series on accelerating the rate of bringing medical devices to the marketplace. They'll be presenting at the OneMed Forum in San Francisco in January 10th and 11th. Thanks for joining us today, guys.
How you doing?
Very good. So can you start out by telling us a little bit about the important characteristics in terms of reducing risk? In our last session, you talked about risk management and how one brings these devices to market efficiently. Can you tell us about sort of this concept of risk in all phases of development of new devices?
Sure. The ideal product development process addresses the highest risk items inherent in a technology early in development. These activities are done while the total investment in the device is still low. By identifying a device's greatest risks in the preliminary phases and engineering feasible solutions to solve these risks, there is substantial evidence to support any business decision. This exponentially increases the probability of success. While this process takes time, designing a device that incorporates these solutions early in development is significantly cheaper and more productive than attempting to incorporate these same solutions into a fully developed product. When effectively managed, technical risk is converted into value.
So can you give sort of examples how this happens and how you kind of real live examples of this?
Sure. There was one device that we were developing that included a pH probe that was extremely susceptible to noise. We had grounded and shielded the probe to the best of our ability without much success. In an attempt to further shield the probe from noise, we installed the probe into a synthetic shell within the device, and the problem was solved. By installing the component into its final configuration, the component performed within specs that otherwise would not have, and allowed development to continue. Had the component performed outside of specs, the development team would have been able to identify this as a high-risk item and begin to mediate these issues.
Yeah, and Brett, let me add on to that just a little bit, because I think this is really important. Marcus has mentioned a technical area of risk, and the other way we look at it here is that any unanswered question, any unmade decision is a form of risk, because until it's resolved, it's an outlier and you don't know. So, for example, that's the other kinds of risks you'll see is in the marketplace, in the market assessment. And so early on, we try to bring in, for example, the marketing people to get a lot of market issues resolved, because if you don't design your product in order to be promoted, so how you're going to promote the product, if you don't know that and then adjust the product accordingly to fit that promotion program, then you have a real problem. You may have to actually make real design changes to the hardware in order to support even a marketing program. And I'll give you an example. We worked on a product before, to get to the specifics, is that it turns out that it originally it was anticipated, this was a surgical device, that it was going to be used because its safety was much lower, so the fatality rate was dramatically lower than the existing products on the market. And so the original promotion plan was to focus on that way. But very early on, we tested that theory. We found out that doctors, physicians, didn't care so much. I mean, I hate to say it, but while lower fatality rate was fine, they had actually come to accept that. What they were really interested in this product is that it allowed them to perform the same procedure in half the time, and therefore half the amount of cost both to them and to the patient. And that was a whole different way of looking at the thing. That we tested it early, got that question answered, resolved early, and changed very much how the product was put together. So that's just another example. It's not just technical risk and technical design decisions. It's all decisions relating to the product which impact risk.
Yeah, you talked in our previous discussion about how to identify some of these early risk items or these high risk components of the process. What is your sense about how a designer figures out which is the high risk items and issues?
So one way that we do identify those high risks is that full specification of all requirements isn't needed. And in fact, when you use that TBD, then rather than guessing at quantitative specifications, these TBD items are indicative of the need for development activities to develop a technical basis for those items. It's also important to specify how these requirements will be tested as they are defined. This helps ensure that they will be in fact testable. And then the project teams can use these project requirement specifications as a project management tool to gauge the impact of requested design changes later in development.
I gotcha. So how does a device with components designed on, I mean, you talked about first principles, sort of things can you talk about the whole notion of first principles?
Absolutely. Simplifying the complex requirements with first principle allows creative solutions to be based on proven technology. A first principle is a basic assumption that cannot be deduced from any other assumption. Developers are then able to translate user needs into product specifications earlier in development based on these first principles.
Right. So for example, if you have a complex technical, like a system, you break it down into its individual components, and then you can write performance requirements on the components. But then there's sub-elements. For example, in a pump, you have bearings, you have an impeller, you have a motor, you have a housing, and you can put performance specifications on those and model each one of those. And so you break it down to its most fundamental pieces, and you find out, what the bearing loads have to be. Then you build that up, and then you can turn it into pump specifications. Likewise, again, you can do this in other non-technical areas. To come back to marketing, if you don't know the value proposition, that's why people want to buy it and how they make money with your product, those are the first principle issues that have to be addressed on that side. And if you don't know those, as Marcus points out, you end up with a TBD or an unmade decision, and all those do is they just push risk out into the future rather than resolving it now.
Okay. So does this create significant delay in the process of having to test these first principles out? I mean, how does this change the speed at which you bring new products to market?
This goes back to that example I said with the pH probe. Our favorite saying around here is to do it like you're going to do it as soon as you can do it. That's a lot to basically say implement the components into the device and test their performance based on requirements as soon as possible. Understanding the functionality of each component independent of the device is essential to designing a successful product, but ultimately the component will not operate independent of the product. Implementing these components earlier than is typically done in development and testing them against system requirements identify high-risk items earlier and allow planning of required mitigating activities.
Right, yeah, and it's a good point because you might think, that to do all this takes time. The other phrase we use is you got to go slow to go fast. And so, and in fact, at the beginning of the project, you are going slower than maybe than the norm. But once you have all this stuff resolved, all these different issues resolved, it does enable a process where you can now go very fast. And as a consequence of that is that a typical Class 2 or Class 3 device around here would typically take from project ideation through filing with the FDA between 6 and 18 months, which is for the industry relatively fast. That half of the project may be solving these initial questions, but once that's done, you can't move out. We call move out promptly.
Interesting. So, yeah, can you talk just a little bit about the time frame on these initial stages of development?
Well, I think we have 4 fundamental phases which we use, and beginning with 0, and then 1, 2, and 3, of course. And it's this thinking phase, if you will, where most of these unknown questions get addressed is our phase 0. And that is where you do all the planning and you bring together all the different resources. So you have the technical people, the engineers, we have the industrial designers, you have the marketing people, along with the regulatory folks and any IP people that you might need. And we do what we do. Go through what we call use cases. So this is where you actually imagine, it's like a mental exercise where you do a vertical slice through the product use, how it's going to be operated, how it's going to be maintained, how it's going to be sold, how it's going to be disposed of, how it's going to be manufactured, and you answer all those questions. And so that process does take probably, Marcus, between a month for simple things to as much as maybe 3 months for very complex things to get things going. And so, but that again, there's no hardware in the lab at this point. There's nothing going on in terms of, on the workbench. This is it's a lot of paper studies. But what that does do is now when you get to your rapid prototyping, your phase 1, that takes place over a period of, between, again, 1 month to, again, maybe 3 months for hard things. and then your detailed engineering. And this is where it gets to be a snap, because you've answered all those things. Now your detailed engineering phase, you've got that in flight throughout the whole project, and you can get that done typically again in another 3 months, because most of the questions the engineers run into that need to be answered and iterated on, you've got that done. Again, maybe a very complex project with a disposable, a manufacturing line, and a durable might take 6 months to get through it all. But it's pretty fast, and because you got the regulatory people in up front and the marketing people, a lot of things that you might have to do, it's serial from one of the typical projects. They've all been done in parallel now, so when you get to that endpoint where you're filing with the FDA, all your questions are answered at that point. So
okay,
I hope that answers that.
Go ahead. Do you want to?
I said, does that answer that for you?
Yeah, that's it. Well, so I was just going to sort of finish with if I'm adopting these principles into the development process as you've described them. So how do I know that I finally got it right and that I really optimized my development process?
Well, you never will be completely optimized. Successful process improvement is continuous, and it cannot be limited in scope. The success of any one initiative must be constantly compared to the baseline data from the previous state of development. When an initiative is successful, great. Maintain that momentum and continue identifying areas needing improvement. But more importantly, when an initiative is a failure, however, capture any lessons learned from that experience and leverage that knowledge moving forward.
Yeah, so what we would say around here, and with our clients or with our own work, is related to that, is that once you solve one area and you've reduced that risk, there's always something else. Something is always the highest risk item. And so this is so with our clients and with ourselves, once we've taken care of one high-risk area and kind of threaded that through the whole process so it's in all of our best practices, well, then now you go after the next one. And so eventually, again, once that's resolved, something else will still be the highest risk item, and then we'll go working on that. So, we think we've run most of the year to year, you think you've got most of the juice that you can get out of it, but when you look 10 years back, it's shocking the amount of improvement we make over when you look at it a longer period. I think that's where you want to get to this continuous, the incremental improvement year over year. And over time, you're going to find that it gives startling results.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point because MPR has been around for some time now. Can you talk about a little bit of the background of MPR and how long you guys have been doing this?
Well, it's an interesting story. The company was founded in 1964, so I guess that's coming on, it'll be 50 years in a couple of years, but yeah, about 47, 48 years now. And the founders of the company were involved in a different kind of large product development program. They were the Greenfield program to develop the first nuclear submarine, and that was done over a period of, say, 3 years, Greenfield. And so they, at that point in time, back in the 40s, they developed some of these product development processes, which we still use today. And in particular, they used this first principle technique, developed this first principles engineering technique. And the reason they did it was not so much for efficiency, Brett. It was really a different reason, and that is that it was developing a program, which is like the Apollo space program, where a lot of lives were at risk. And so they said, hey, the only way we're going to make sure this goes right and not have a bunch of fatalities during the development program is to really make sure that everything really works the first time. And they did feel they were inspired. They felt like they really were in a race against what was then the Soviet Union, now our allies, right? And so they felt like speed was also the essence, but it had to work right the first time. And so they developed these techniques in order to get that program moving and underway in as little time possible. And in fact, the very first prototype ship, which was built, stayed in service for over 40-some years. The Nautilus was actually retired, I think, about a decade ago. So it stayed in service for many, many years of active duty service as a successful member of the fleet there, if you will. And that's the same process we use today, which is to, even now, typically our first prototype actually ends up in a clinical setting and approved by the FDA. So, it went from submarines to a lot of those guys got out into the marketplace, and so they went into a lot of the medical field, which is high technology, and that actually got us involved in 1965 in the first artificial heart program. And so we, through that and some pharmaceutical work, people approached us. it just grew into the business we have today.
Terrific. Well, terrific. It sounds like you clearly have some great experience in this, and we really appreciate your thoughts and for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you.
Okay, that is Marcus Hadley and Christian Haler with the Medical Device Group at MPR Associates, which is an international design firm. They will actually be at the OneMed Forum in San Francisco running a workshop on techniques to accelerate the development of medical devices and bring them to market. Thanks again for joining us. This is Brett Johnson, OneMed Radio in New York.